Are you poor? Are you living in 18th century England? Do you want to go on holiday? If you answered yes to those three questions, I have one simple trick to achieve your travelling dreams. Commit a crime. Penal transportation was a practice used by nations to remove their criminals from their homeland and rehome them far away, often to a new colony. No one did penal transportation quite like the British Empire. You see, England had a problem. In the 16 and 1700s, its prisons were filling up, and it kept creating new laws which, in turn, created more prisoners. It got to the point where all the prisons were full and criminals were being kept on boats called hulks. These were truly awful places. These hulks each held hundreds of prisoners in cramped conditions below decks, often with no ventilation or access to the outside. Food was rationed to biscuits and pea soup, 5 pounds of bread, half an ox cheek, and porridge twice a week. Disease was rife within these floating prisons due to the cramped conditions and complete lack of sanitation. Escaped prisoners complained that dead bodies would be left for days before being taken away. On one ship in 1778, 28% of its inmates died from disease. Prisoners are known to have deliberately broken bones by dropping tables on their limbs to be removed from the prisons. To get a better idea of how bad these hulks were, during the American Revolution, more people died in prison hulks than they did in battle. The solution to this problem of overcrowded prisons was simple: transport the prisoners off elsewhere to the Empire's colonies. Anyone could be sentenced to transportation. Men and women got transported, as well as young children, even if their parents were not being transported. Although able-bodied men were most likely to get this sentence. You could get transported for a whole range of crimes, most of which were petty theft. One man, Joseph Lowe, was sentenced to transportation for stealing some oranges. Many early people sentenced to transportation were war prisoners. Initially, strong prisoners with skills likely to help in a new colony were sent to America from the early 1600s, up until the American Revolution in 1776. Around 50,000 prisoners were sent. Most were sold into indentured servitude, which is a sort of forced labour without pay for a set amount of time. Criminals worked mostly on farms or construction before being set free. But transportation really ramped up in Australia. Captain Cook claimed Australia for the British Empire in 1770, and after the American Revolution, it was decided that this would be the next best place to send prisoners. In 1787, the first fleet of 11 prisoner ships was set out from Portsmouth for Botany Bay, carrying 1,467 crew and convicts. The youngest, a 13-year-old girl called Elizabeth Hayward. She had stolen a linen gown and silk bonnet. For the prisoners, the journey was hell, chained together and rarely being allowed up from below decks, with no toilets, just buckets, and these weren't emptied if the seas were rough. Miraculously, only 31 people died on their 18-month voyage. This was due to the great planning of Captain Phillip, who ensured that all travelling had a good food supply and ate as much fruit as they possibly could to stop scurvy. The fleet arrived in Botany Bay in January 1788, but eventually landed just north in Sydney Cove on the 26th. The local people, Ura, were very curious about the newcomers, apparently not being able to tell the difference between the men and the women, an indication of how awful the prisoners looked. The first years for these transported criminals were incredibly tough. This was a brand new land with a completely different environment to England and much of the rest of the world. All the plants and animals were new, and no one really knew how to farm the land effectively. Hunger and death were not far off. The transported convicts were bad workers, and who can blame them? They'd just been transported in awful conditions on one of the longest journeys ever, and were now living in makeshift tents halfway across the globe, and were being told they had to build a colony. Despite the bad work ethic, some progress was made. A stone house was built for the governor, and a plan of Sydney town was laid out. Unsurprisingly, convicts couldn't work well in chains, and as such they were allowed to work without them when supervised. However, convicts managed to escape to the bush, but they didn't stand any better chance there, and many returned to face the relatively mild punishment of a lashing and returning to work. The bad work ethics of the convicts had many consequences. Animals were left untended, and much of the livestock simply walked off. Fishing catches were reducing, and planted crops were not looked after. Convicts repeatedly broke their tools or lost them to ensure they wouldn't have to work. It seemed convicts would sooner starve than work. Theft was commonplace. Even British Marines stole. 6 were hung for stealing from the government supplies. Additionally, the new colony treated the local Ura people poorly. In turn, the Ura continuously attacked the settlers, and the oncoming winter only made things worse. Somehow the colony survived the winter, although many died of scurvy and dysentery, and by the following summer, things had started to pick up a bit. Some gardens began to flourish and produce food, and convicts were put to work creating farms, especially in the newly found Rose Hill area where the best farming land was. However, convicts were still incredibly lazy. The Marines in the colony also refused to do any manual labour either. Times were still tough. Fortunately, Australia is the land of plenty. The land was so fertile that crops grew larger than any had grown in England. There were huge numbers of wild animals, both on land and in the sea. There was an abundance of fruit trees and vegetables which helped to sustain the colony and transported convicts in the early years. The Euro attacks continued, and there was a real fear that the new colony would be wiped out. To help stop the attacks by the Euro, Captain, now Governor Phillips, wanted to show them how nice the British were. He decided the best way to do this was to kidnap one of them. Your guess is as good as mine. The British managed to capture one man called Arabanu. He was chained but treated well by the British. His rations were never cut, even when the colony was near starvation. Unsurprisingly, the attacks continued, although the Euro never came to rescue him. At the point of starvation, in May 1789, supply ships began to arrive, the first being the Sirius. It carried 4 months of supplies, seeds, and gunpowder. However, by December, conditions were back to how they were before the Sirius arrived. Theft was still commonplace, and convicts were still atrocious workers. It got to the point where, at the start of 1790, most of the colony, convicts and free people, were starving. No one had proper clothes. They'd been worn out for a while, and people were simply walking around barefoot in rags. Even though people were starving, the convicts still refused to work unless done so at gunpoint from the Marines. The food situation got so bad that Governor Phillips ordered people only to work in the morning, as they simply didn't have enough energy to work longer. At least 3 convicts starved to death. To make matters worse, in June 1790, another convict ship arrived with 200 women on board and no spare food. 2 more ships arrived at the end of June. As they entered the bay, the bodies of those who died on the journey were being thrown overboard. What an entrance. From these boats, approximately 25% of the convicts had died on the journey, with many still chained to living convicts. Nevertheless, some food supplies arrived to help the starving colony. By the start of 1791, there would begin to be a string of ships coming and going from the colony, and they were finally at little risk of starving to death. Rose Hill, the area of best soil, had 200 acres of farmland, brick houses, and 2 main streets. It looked almost like a proper town. Despite the progress, the continued arrival of more and more convicts prolonged the issues plaguing the colony. Theft and disease was still commonplace. During 1792, 1 in 8 people in the entire colony died due to disease. However, from here on out, the colony and transported convicts survived with few setbacks. There was the period where rum was used instead of money, and the time 200 Irish war prisoners rose up, only to be defeated by 29 British soldiers. Separate transportation colonies were set up on Norfolk Island, and the worst criminals were sent to Tasmania. In total, 160,000 convicts arrived in Australia. The conditions on convict transportation ships barely improved, as captains were paid by how many people they could get on the ships in England, not by how many made it alive in Australia. Despite their work ethic, the transported convicts built roads, farms, villages, and cities. The British Empire ended transportation in 1868. But what happened to all the convicts who had been transported? Well, if they survived their sentence, often either 7 or 14 years, they were free to go. They could go back home to England. The cruel reality was that there was no real way to get back home. With no money, having not been paid for their years of work, freed convicts couldn't afford a place on a ship back to England, and so nearly all stayed. That means that, today, 1 in 5 Australians are a direct descendant of a transported convict. Don't go to Australia.